It was February the 9th, 2004, a Monday, when the cold swallowed her. The kind of cold that doesn't just sting the skin but seeps deeper, burrowing into the spaces between breath and bone. Snow drifted lazily across Route 1 and 12, a narrow stretch of road winding through the white silence of Haverhill, New Hampshire. The sky had already surrendered to dusk when a black satin sedan came to a sudden stop against a snowbank, its front end crumpled, facing the wrong way. Minutes later, a neighbour placed a call to police, and by the time an officer arrived on the scene, less than 10 minutes after the crash, the driver was gone. No footprints led away from the car, no signs of struggle, no blood in the snow, just an abandoned vehicle, a few scattered belongings, and silence. The woman who vanished that night was 21-year-old Maura Murray, a nursing student at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. Bright, athletic, and disciplined, Maura had once attended West Point before transferring to UMass to pursue nursing. She was the kind of person whose life looked promising on paper, but in the days leading up to her disappearance, something began to unravel. On the Thursday before she vanished, Maura broke down at work. She had a campus job at the security desk, a quiet spot where she mostly sat and signed students in and out of dorm buildings. But that night, she was inconsolable. Her supervisor found her staring blankly at a computer screen, tears streaming down her face. When asked what was wrong, Maura simply whispered, "My sister." Later, her sister Kathleen would admit that she'd called Maura from a liquor store that night, relapsing, crying, lost in a moment of weakness. Maura had listened, and whatever pain she absorbed from that call, she carried it silently. Then, over the next few days, Maura began making quiet, almost surgical decisions. She emailed her professors to say there had been a death in the family. There hadn't been. She packed up her room, labeling boxes as if preparing for a move. She withdrew most of the money from her bank account, stopped by a liquor store, bought a small assortment of alcohol, and then got in her black satin and drove north. She didn't tell anyone where she was going. Not her friends, not her family, not her boyfriend. She left no note, no clear message, no goodbye. At 7:27 p.m. that evening, the police in Haverhill received a 911 call from a woman who lived near Route 112. She'd heard a loud bang and looked outside to see a car against a snowbank. A second witness, another neighbour, reported seeing a young woman near the vehicle, apparently uninjured but visibly shaken. He offered help. She declined. Said she'd already called for assistance. She hadn't. And when the police arrived 7 minutes later, she was no longer there. Inside the car, they found Maura's belongings: school books, a box of wine, her accident report forms from a minor fender bender the night before. The driver's side door was locked. The car was not drivable. Her cell phone and bank card were missing. But there were no footprints in the snow leading into the forest, no drag marks, no indication of which direction she may have gone. The search that followed was hesitant at first. The local police treated it as a walkaway, a young woman fleeing a minor accident, likely to resurface. After all, Maura was an adult. She had chosen to leave her dorm, chosen to drive, chosen not to tell anyone. To the responding officers, there was no immediate sign of foul play. But that assumption, born from logic and protocol, would soon be consumed by something much darker. When Maura's father, Fred Murray, arrived in New Hampshire the next morning, the weight of the situation landed like an avalanche. He had spoken with Maura the night before her disappearance. They'd been car shopping. He had lent her his Toyota for the weekend. She had gotten into a minor accident with it that Saturday night, a low-speed crash into a guardrail. She was upset but seemed okay. Still, something was off. And now she was gone. Fred was not a man to accept silence. From the moment he stepped foot in Haverhill, he began searching, asking questions, retracing steps, pressing police to look deeper. He knew his daughter, knew how methodical she could be. She wouldn't just vanish, not like this. The days stretched on. Snow fell again, covering the landscape and whatever traces Maura might have left behind. The ground hardened, the trails went cold, and the speculation began to take root. Online forums, message boards, late-night whispers. Everyone had a theory. She ran away, she was abducted, she got into the wrong car, she wandered into the woods and succumbed to the cold, she planned it. She didn't. The truth was, no one knew. But what struck people, what continues to haunt anyone who hears the story, is the stillness of it all. How someone could just disappear, not in a city, not in a crowd, but on a quiet rural road, in a place where nothing usually happens. No cameras, no witnesses, no signals from her phone, no activity on her credit cards, as if the night itself had swallowed her. Her dorm room back at UMass remained just as she'd left it. Clothes folded, schoolwork unfinished, boxes packed. It wasn't the room of someone planning to die, nor was it the room of someone running away forever. It was something in between, a question mark carved into the silence. Fred didn't stop. He couldn't. Over the weeks and months that followed, he returned to Haverhill again and again. He walked the woods, stood at the curve in the road where her Saturn was found, talked to anyone who might have seen something or thought they had, and he fought with police, demanded access to case files, hired private investigators, spoke to the press, whatever it took. Because he knew from the very beginning that something wasn't right, and he knew that if he didn't keep asking the question, no one else would. Where is Maura Murray? The days after Maura Murray's disappearance felt like a blur, both to her family and to the handful of investigators assigned to her case in those first hours. There had been no obvious signs of a crime, and in the absence of blood or a witness, the event was still categorized by authorities as a missing adult. But beneath that classification was something deeper, a tension, an unease. Fred Murray felt it from the beginning. He wasn't simply missing a daughter. He was confronting a silence that felt unnatural. Back at UMass Amherst, Maura's friends and professors were stunned. No one could make sense of it. Her roommate returned to find the dorm quiet, her side of the room packed up as though she were moving out, not chaotically, but deliberately, labels on boxes, notebooks in stacks. It didn't suggest panic or flight, it suggested intention. Yet there had been no conversations, no goodbye. Even her closest friends hadn't known she was planning a trip. They thought she might have gone home for a few days. When news broke that she was missing, panic replaced confusion. Bill Rausch, Maura's boyfriend at the time, was stationed in Oklahoma. He had been a fellow West Point cadet, and their relationship was intense, long distance, and fraught with the kind of tension that builds when time zones and secrets start to define a connection. Bill flew to New Hampshire immediately. He met Fred, joined the search, and was present during those early, raw interviews with police. On the outside, he appeared calm, committed, but his presence introduced another thread into the increasingly tangled web of Maura's life. Their relationship hadn't been perfect. There were suggestions of infidelity, text messages that hinted at mistrust, rumours of surveillance, one partner tracking the other. Friends would later describe the relationship as consuming, and yet to most it seemed unlikely that Bill had anything to do with her disappearance. He had an airtight alibi. He was hundreds of miles away. Still, in a case with no answers, suspicion was something that drifted freely from one person to another, like smoke from a fire no one could locate. As the days turned into weeks, local law enforcement began to realize that Maura's disappearance wasn't something that would resolve itself quietly. Initially, their response had been procedural. A missing person, limited evidence, wait and see. But now the case was gaining traction. News outlets started calling. Her story appeared in print. And worst of all, the search had yielded nothing. Not a single usable lead, not a shred of definitive evidence. She was gone in the most complete sense of the word. The family pushed for more. Fred demanded dogs, helicopters, dive teams. The wooded area near the crash site was combed through again and again, though each pass felt more symbolic than productive. There were rumours. A neighbour had heard something in the woods. A cadaver dog had hit on a scent. A house down the road had a suspicious cellar. But every time a path opened, it ended abruptly. Nothing held. No evidence materialised. At one point, a man named Rick Forcier came forward. A local contractor, Rick claimed that he had seen a young woman jogging along the road the night of Maura's disappearance. She was wearing jeans, no coat. The image was eerie, but his story came months later, and when pressed for details, his account wavered. The timeline didn't line up neatly. Could it have been someone else? Could he have misremembered? Maybe. Or maybe he'd seen her, the last person to do so. Other leads were stranger still. A rag found stuffed in Maura's exhaust pipe. Was it sabotage? An attempt by Maura to hide smoke from a malfunctioning car? Or something more sinister? No one knew. Then there was a report of a strange vehicle parked near the crash site, a cigarette seen glowing in the driver's hand. No one ever identified the driver. Police logged it, then moved on. But Fred didn't move on. He couldn't. He believed someone had picked up Maura that night. that the crash hadn't been the end of her journey, but the beginning of something darker. Maybe she'd accepted a ride. Maybe she'd been forced. Maybe she'd been tricked into trusting the wrong person. His theory rested on the timeline, the impossibly narrow window between the 911 call and the arrival of police. If Maura had fled the scene on foot, she would have left tracks, she would have been seen. But she hadn't been. It was as if she had evaporated. Online, Maura's case began to take on a life of its own. Web sleuths and other forums became magnets for amateur investigators. People created timelines, speculated about motives, pulled satellite maps, examined weather data, road conditions, and moon phases. Every photo was scrutinized. Every piece of police correspondence, when it could be obtained, was analyzed like sacred text. A kind of digital religion formed around her absence. Some people were respectful, others were not. Some treated her like a mystery to solve, others like a ghost to chase. In the midst of this, Maura's family fractured. The stress of the investigation, the scrutiny, the lack of answers. Grief has a way of isolating people, of magnifying the smallest hurt. There were disagreements about what happened, about how to talk to the press, about which theories to believe, but always, under the surface, the same wound. She was gone. As the first anniversary approached, the landscape had changed. Snow fell again, covering the place where her car had once rested. But there were no new signs, no sudden revelations, just another winter, another year lost, and with it, a deepening silence. Fred stood again at the bend in Route 112, staring into the trees. He remembered standing there the day after she disappeared, remembered speaking into the wind. "Maura, where are you?" Now, a year later, the wind still carried no answer. The forest remained indifferent, the ground unbroken. He had grown more vocal with time, more combative. He accused the police of withholding information, of mishandling the scene. He believed the case hadn't been taken seriously from the beginning, and maybe he was right. Or maybe it wouldn't have mattered. Some disappearances are just that, a vanishing so complete that even the facts become unmoored. But the question lingered. If Maura had run, why not take money? Why not pack clothes? Why not leave a note? If she'd been taken, how had no one seen anything? And if she had died, wandered into the woods in a haze of confusion and cold, where was her body? Nothing made sense, and the human mind, faced with senselessness, reaches for pattern. That's where the theories came from. That's why people still searched, still guessed, still hoped. Because a clean vanishing doesn't feel possible. Because someone, somewhere, had to know something. Because Maura Murray didn't just disappear, something happened, and someone was still keeping that secret. In the early months after Maura vanished, it became clear that the story was evolving into something more than just a missing persons case. It was taking on the contours of a riddle, one etched into cold asphalt and thick pine woods, tangled in silence and guesswork. In the absence of evidence, narrative took hold, and in the absence of Maura's voice, everyone else's grew louder. Fred Murray's own voice became sharper, more resolute, more desperate. He believed his daughter had been taken, and the farther time stretched without an answer, the more convinced he became that someone in that town, perhaps someone who lived just a few steps from the crash site, knew what had happened. He visited Haverhill relentlessly, returned to the spot on Route 112 with his own search teams, knocked on doors, asked questions the police wouldn't. His energy never flagged, even when the rest of the world moved on. In one of those visits, Fred fixated on a particular house, a short distance from where Maura's Saturn had been found. Something about it unnerved him. A scent dog had once shown interest in the property's basement, though it was never officially searched. The homeowner refused to let authorities inside. No warrant was issued. That single act, a refusal to open a door, became a point of obsession. To Fred, it was a red flag waving in a forest of indifference. He wasn't alone in his fixation. Online forums seized on it, feeding a growing mythology around the house. Theories flourished, secret rooms, hidden evidence, a cover-up involving local officials. None of it could be proven. Much of it was almost certainly exaggerated. But in a story built on shadows, even a closed door could seem like a trapdoor to the truth. What made it all worse was how ordinary everything appeared. The road was still quiet. The woods were still thick and indifferent. The people were still guarded. Life went on, except for Maura's family, who had been frozen in time since that February night. By the second year, the strain was beginning to show. The media had taken a new interest in the story, this time with longer features, interviews, and speculations. Reporters came to town, cameras arrived, journalists asked hard questions, but their time was limited. They would stay for a day, maybe two, and then they'd leave, taking with them a snapshot, not a story. And each time Fred would be left standing alone in the snow, still waiting. What hurt the most was not the lack of answers, but the lack of motion. The feeling that the case was no longer moving forward, that it had become a kind of open secret, known, but not spoken of. When police updates stopped coming, the Murray family filed lawsuits to obtain case files. They were denied. The authorities insisted the case was still active and releasing documents would jeopardize potential leads. Fred was skeptical. He believed they were protecting themselves, not Maura. Meanwhile, investigators remained tight-lipped. They said little, released less. Publicly, they maintained that they had followed every viable lead. Privately, some former officers would later admit that the early days of the investigation had been hampered by assumption. The belief that Maura was not in danger, that she had chosen to leave, that she was an adult making adult decisions. That belief, innocent on the surface, may have cost them time and evidence. There were efforts to reignite the search. Volunteers returned with cadaver dogs. A few months later, another team brought in ground-penetrating radar to examine the infamous basement of that house near the crash. The scans reportedly showed anomalies, signs of disturbed soil beneath the foundation. But again, without consent or a warrant, no digging could be done. The house remained sealed. The mystery remained intact. And so the story morphed. No longer just a tale of disappearance, it became a parable of frustration. A story about barriers, not just the physical barriers of snow and forest, but the institutional ones of privacy, procedure, and protection. It became about who gets to look, who gets to ask, who gets to keep secrets. As time passed, Maura's life before the crash came under closer scrutiny. Her years at West Point, her sudden departure after an honor code violation involving stolen items, the incident with a stolen credit card number in Amherst used to order food, the breakdown at work just before her trip. These moments were picked apart endlessly, as though her flaws held the key to her fate, as though a person's worst moments somehow foretold their disappearance. But those who knew Maura remembered more than just those fragments. They remembered her as quiet, disciplined, almost painfully private, a long-distance runner who found peace in solitude, a student with a plan, even if the edges were fraying, a daughter who checked in often, even when things were hard in midterm. She was not reckless, she was not impulsive, she was careful, methodical, and that's what made her disappearance feel so jarring. It was not just that she vanished, it was that she vanished while appearing to move with intention. There were signs she had planned something, or at least something small. The email to professors, the printed MapQuest directions found in her car, a phone call earlier that day to a woman in New Hampshire about renting a condo for a weekend getaway, the items she purchased at the liquor store. It all suggested a trip, a break, time alone, but not an escape, not an erasure. And then there was the call. 2 days after her disappearance, a voicemail was left on Bill Rausch's phone. The message was silent. The call had come from a calling card linked to the American Red Cross. There was no way to trace its origin. The timing was strange, the silence even stranger. Bill believed it might have been Maura, reaching out, unable to speak. Others dismissed it. But in a case like this, nothing could be dismissed. Every unexplained detail had to be held up to the light. Theories multiplied. Some believed she had planned the disappearance, that she'd felt overwhelmed by school, by relationships, by shame, and had chosen to disappear, maybe to start over, maybe to live off-grid. Others were convinced she had been abducted, that someone had seen her vulnerable that night and seized the opportunity. A few believed she'd wandered into the woods and succumbed to the cold, her body hidden beneath snow and brush. But no search had ever found remains, no wildlife disturbance, no scent trail, nothing. What was undeniable, by the second year, was that Maura Murray had become more than herself. She had become a symbol of fear, of failure, of a system unable to find a young woman in the digital age. Her name was invoked in other disappearances. Her face became familiar even to those who had never known her. And her father, now a fixture in the missing persons advocacy world, had become something else entirely. A man haunted not only by loss, but by the belief that the truth was within reach, if only someone would speak. Fred continued to return to the site. Each visit was quieter than the last. Fewer volunteers, fewer cameras, but always the same question burning in his throat. Where did she go? And why won't anyone say? The fourth winter since Maura's disappearance arrived like all the others, quiet, sharp, and unrelenting. The trees along Route 112 stood bare again, their branches aching under the familiar weight of snow. It was the kind of landscape that swallowed sound, that erased footprints in hours, and that held secrets tightly beneath layers of frost. By now, this place was not just where Maura had vanished. It was where time itself had stopped for those who loved her. Fred Murray was aging, but not slowing. His search had become ritual. Every year he returned, tracing the same path, asking the same questions. Not because he expected new answers, but because stopping would feel like letting her go. He kept every flyer ever printed, every tip emailed to him, every photo from every volunteer search. His home had become a living archive, a shrine not only to his daughter, but to the stubborn endurance of unanswered questions. In the spring of 2008, 4 years after that February night, Fred received a tip, one of many, but this one was different. A woman who lived across state lines claimed her brother had said something odd shortly after Maura's disappearance. Something vague, something about a girl on Route 112. She had dismissed it at the time, but it had gnawed at her. Now, years later, she couldn't shake the feeling that it meant something. Fred clung to that tip, tracked the man down, but like so many threads it frayed in his hands. The brother denied it. There was nothing to tie him to that night, just another echo with no source. These were the years when theories flourished unchecked. The community of online sleuths, once tight-knit, almost noble in its mission, had fractured into factions. Some believed Maura had died in the woods, others thought she had staged her disappearance. Still others pointed fingers at locals, at law enforcement, even at her own family. The story had been retold so many times, so publicly, that it no longer belonged to the people who lived it. It had become a kind of collective obsession, a campfire tale shared between strangers behind screens. Maura wasn't just a person anymore. She was a cipher, a canvas people painted their fears on. James Renner, a journalist turned investigator, had by then stepped into the storm. He dove headfirst into Maura's story with a kind of relentless curiosity that blurred the line between investigation and intrusion. Renner asked hard questions. He published uncomfortable truths. He dug into the Murray family's past, into Maura's old relationships, into her time at West Point, at UMass, into rumours of a secret pregnancy, of a second life. He didn't offer conclusions, just possibilities. To some he was courageous, to others he was reckless. Fred considered him the latter. But even Renner's most controversial claims revealed something undeniable. The story of Maura's disappearance was now a cultural phenomenon. It had transcended the facts, and the deeper people dug, the more they realised how fragile those facts really were. For example, the car itself, the Black Saturn, had long been a centrepiece of the case. But years later, questions remained. Why had it crashed with no skid marks? Why was there a rag stuffed into the tailpipe? Something Fred swore Maura would never have done? Was it sabotage? Was it panic? Or was it just the desperate improvisation of a car failing in the cold? There was also the detail of the alcohol she'd purchased just before leaving Amherst. A box of wine, a bottle of Bailey's, some Seagram's malt beverages. Some saw it as preparation for a short retreat. Others saw it as coping. But it complicated the narrative, especially when an open box of wine was found in the backseat of her car, with red stains splashed across the interior. Some thought it was evidence of a head wound. Others thought it was simply wine spilled during the crash. It had never been definitively tested. Another maybe in a story made of them. The more you looked at the timeline, the tighter it became. The crash was reported at 7:27 p.m. Police arrived by 7:46 p.m. Somewhere in that short window, Maura had disappeared. One neighbour said they saw her standing at the vehicle, dazed, but unharmed. Another said she'd refused help, that she claimed to have already called Semsei. A lie, since no such call had been placed. Why lie? Was she scared of something, of someone? And if she had wandered off, why didn't the dogs find her? Why didn't the cold claim her within hours? Why didn't spring reveal her body? One theory long discussed but impossible to prove was that Maura had accepted a ride from someone, that they had passed by during those brief minutes before police arrived, that she had climbed into a stranger's car, or worse, someone she knew. If so, it would mean the woods weren't her grave. The road was only the beginning. That possibility terrified her family more than any other. For a long time there was a kind of protective distance in thinking she'd chosen to leave, that she'd gone into the forest and perhaps died in peace, hidden by the elements. But if someone had taken her, it meant something worse, something ongoing. It meant a lie had been maintained for years, that somewhere someone still walked free, carrying the weight of her disappearance and the silence that followed. And that silence, more than anything, had become the loudest part of the story. There were times, in the years that followed, when Maura's case came back into the spotlight. A new podcast, a true crime series, a fresh set of eyes from a state investigator or retired detective who offered a new angle, a different theory. But each time it led back to the same place, a frozen road in New Hampshire, a disabled car and a missing girl whose name refused to fade. Her mother, Laurie, had held on to hope for years, but time wore her down. In 2009 she passed away after a battle with cancer. She had died without answers, her heart still tuned to the voice of a daughter who never came home. Fred had stood at her funeral, not just grieving a wife, but watching another thread to Maura's life disappear. Julie, Maura's sister, continued her own fight in parallel. She had become an advocate for other missing persons cases. She tried to use the attention around Maura's story to bring light to others, but behind the work there was pain, a guilt she couldn't name, a question she couldn't escape. What if I'd called that night? What if I'd said something different? She had to live with the echo of that moment, unchangeable. By the end of the decade, Maura's case had been formally handed over to the cold case unit of the New Hampshire State Police. It was still open, still active, but no new leads were made public. No new searches were announced. And Fred, still relentless, filed one more lawsuit, still trying to pry open sealed records. He believed the truth lived in those files, that someone was protecting someone, that silence had been chosen, and he would not forgive that. In a small room in his home, Fred kept a whiteboard covered in names and arrows and dates. A crude map of Haverhill was pinned to the wall, with Maura's crash site marked in red. Every year he added notes. Every year, more arrows. But the lines never led to a body, only to questions. It had been nearly 10 years, but in his mind the search hadn't ended, because a body was never found. Because no one had confessed. Because no one had said, "She's gone." And as long as that silence held, so did hope, cold and cruel as it may be. By the 10th anniversary of Maura Murray's disappearance, her case had become something more than a personal tragedy. It was a cultural touchstone, the kind of mystery that outlasts memory and seeps into folklore, the kind whispered about on long drives through the woods or dissected in late-night podcast episodes. To many, Maura was no longer just a missing woman. She was the missing woman, an enduring enigma, a symbol of what happens when a person vanishes into the folds of a quiet town and is never heard from again. But for Fred Murray, this wasn't folklore, it wasn't theory, it was his daughter, and the road hadn't grown any quieter for him. If anything, it had only gotten lonelier. The helpers who had once stood beside him, volunteers, journalists, psychics, even sympathetic officers, had faded away over time. The leads had dried up, but his resolve had not. Fred kept returning to that place, to that curve on Route 112, like a man caught in a loop. Because in his eyes, this wasn't just where Maura vanished. It was the last place she had been. And until something was found, a bone, a scrap of clothing, a witness with courage, it would remain the only place that tethered him to her. There were years when things seemed like they might break open. A rumour would spread, a witness would talk, a new piece of ground would be disturbed, but it never led to her. In 2011, investigators received a tip about a blue backpack buried behind a rural property in a nearby town, one that resembled the backpack Maura was believed to have taken with her. For days, speculation flared, but when the item was recovered and analysed, it wasn't hers, just another coincidence, another ghost mistaken for a clue. The cadence of the investigation became tragically predictable. Every February, media attention would spike. Reporters would call Fred, old articles would be recirculated, Podcasts would do special episodes, and then, by March, the world would move on again. But for Fred and Julie, the calendar wasn't divided by months or seasons anymore. It was divided by what could have happened and what didn't. One of the more unnerving aspects of the case was the behaviour of certain locals, not because they were definitively guilty of anything, but because so many had retreated into a kind of impenetrable silence. Over the years, Fred and other advocates had come to believe that someone in that town had either seen something or heard something and had chosen not to come forward. Maybe out of fear, maybe out of loyalty, or maybe because the truth was too messy. But time had made it worse. The longer the silence held, the more tangled the consequences became. Speaking now would raise questions about why they hadn't spoken then. And that for once, that blank, enduring quiet, was the most damning thing of all. There was the house again. Always the house. The one near the crash site, the one that refused access, the one where the scent dogs had once shown a flicker of interest. By 2016, the family and supporters had raised enough money for a private search team to return with new cadaver dogs and scanning equipment. Once more, anomalies were found beneath the basement floor. Once more, hopes flared, but again, no warrant was issued. The homeowners denied entry. The case, technically still open, did not provide enough probable cause. Law enforcement held their ground. The house stood undisturbed. What remained, year after year, were the artefacts, the things Maura had touched. Her Saturn sedan, now stored in an evidence facility, her belongings from the dorm still boxed, the liquor she had purchased, the ATM footage showing her last known appearance on camera, bundled in a winter jacket, face neutral, movement steady. She didn't look frightened, she didn't look unwell, she looked like a person going somewhere. But where? That question became a kind of curse. Where was she going? Maura had printed MapQuest directions to Burlington, Vermont. She had called a woman about renting a cabin in the White Mountains. She had packed snacks, alcohol, her textbooks. She had left behind her computer but taken her cell phone, which notably never pinged again after the crash. It was as if she had planned a brief getaway. Time to clear her head. A solitary retreat. That's what some friends believed. That's what her sister clung to. That she was overwhelmed, that she needed space, that she had intended to come back, but she didn't. In the absence of evidence, darker possibilities began to feel more plausible. A passing motorist with bad intentions, a nearby resident who had seen her crash and lured her inside, an opportunistic predator who happened upon the scene in the narrow window between witnesses and police. Any of those scenarios would require speed, confidence, and planning, but not necessarily. All it would take is luck, the wrong person in the right place at the wrong time. The case became a pressure cooker. In 2017, Oxygen Network produced a 6-part documentary series on Maura's disappearance. The show, though respectful in tone, stirred old wounds. It brought new eyes to the case. A new generation of armchair detectives began to pick it apart all over again. Fred appeared in the series. He stood in the snow again, pointed at the trees again, explained the same timeline again. And when the show ended, the silence resumed. But there were moments, brief, heartbreaking moments, that pierced the fog. One winter, a woman posted anonymously to a message board. She said she believed she had seen Maura, that she'd served her in a restaurant somewhere in northern Vermont years ago, that the woman seemed nervous, avoided eye contact, paid in cash. When asked, she gave a fake name. But her voice, she said, had a sadness to it, a weight, the kind that doesn't come from being lost but from staying lost on purpose. That post was shared widely, investigated, debunked, or maybe ignored. It faded like all the rest. By the 15th anniversary, Fred Murray was tired. His hair had greyed, his movements slower, but the fire, the impossible gut-level need to know, remained. He said it in every interview. I just want to bring her home. There was no anger in his voice anymore, just gravity. He had learned to live in a kind of half-world where grief and hope shared the same room, where a father could both mourn and refuse to mourn because until he knew, he couldn't let go. He spoke less often to the press. The story he feared had become entertainment, something consumed and forgotten, something cheapened by overexposure. And yet he was also grateful for every person who still cared, for every stranger who left flowers at the crash site, for every message that read, "We haven't forgotten her." Because in a case like Maura's, forgetting is the final erasure. And that's what he feared more than death, that Maura would not be found but simply fade. Into snow, into trees, into the long, cold hush of unanswered questions, and the terrible possibility that the person who could end it, the person who knows, had chosen, every day for years, not to speak. 16 years had passed. Seasons rose and fell like breath. But in the small New Hampshire town where Maura Murray vanished, nothing really changed. The forest was still there, dense, quiet and watchful. The curve on Route 112 still looked exactly as it had in 2004. Even the mailbox posts along the roadside had aged slowly, almost stubbornly, as if they too had settled into the story, unwilling to forget. In the years since Maura's disappearance, the world had transformed. Social media exploded. True crime went from niche interest to mainstream phenomenon. Cold cases were reopened. Documentaries streamed worldwide. Yet Maura's case, despite its constant exposure, had not moved forward. Instead, it seemed to move in circles. The same questions, the same theories, the same grief, looping endlessly like a reel stuck on replay. Fred Murray still refused to let go. His energy had waned, his body showing the toll of 2 decades of searching. But his eyes remained sharp, always watching, always reading, between the lines of every police statement, every news report, every anonymous tip. If you asked him, he would say Maura was not gone, not in the spiritual sense. She was waiting to be found. He still believed that someone held the key, and that whoever that person was, they had simply chosen to keep their mouths shut. By 2020, interest in the case flared again when a new generation of internet sleuths picked it up, treating it like an unsolved code. They created interactive maps, pulled cell tower data, reconstructed weather patterns from the night she vanished. One group tracked vehicle movements based on snowplow jeeps logs from the state's highway department. It wasn't officially sanctioned, but it was exhaustive. One anomaly stood out, a short 2-minute gap in a plow truck's GPS data less than half a mile from Maura's crash site. The records didn't explain it. A technical glitch, maybe, or maybe not. Fred latched onto it. He submitted the data to the cold case unit, but as always the response was clinical. Noted, but insufficient. No follow-up, no warrant, no progress. That gap, like so many in Maura's story, remained a blank. That same year, investigators finally returned to the house near the crash site, the one that had long been the centre of so much speculation. With new equipment and new cadaver dogs, they performed a full basement search. The floor was broken open, soil tested. There had been rumours years ago of blood beneath that floor. Whispers, nothing verified. Now they had the tools to know for sure. They found nothing. No remains, no biological evidence, no proof that Maura had ever stepped foot in that house. For Fred, it was a crushing blow, not because he was surprised, but because it had been the last physical location that gave him a reason to believe the answer might lie underground. And now that it didn't, he was left again with the vast open air. No walls, no borders, just possibility, endless, exhausting and empty. Julie Murray had grown into the role of advocate. Maura's sister had once tried to separate her grief from the investigation, but over time the two had fused. She became a face of the case, attending conferences, speaking on podcasts, lobbying lawmakers for better support systems for families of the missing. She was articulate and composed, even as her heart carried an unrelenting ache. She understood something crucial, that if Maura's story was to endure, it had to be human first, mystery second. It wasn't about clues anymore. It was about dignity. There were still moments, strange flickering moments, when it felt like everything might change. One woman claimed she saw Maura at a truck stop near the Canadian border, working quietly behind a food counter under a different name. She swore the woman looked at her and froze, as if caught. But when she returned to the same location days later, the woman was gone. No employee matched the description. No surveillance footage was kept. Another ghost. And then there was the postcard. It arrived in the spring of 2021, postmarked from Maine. The writing was clean, typed on a manual typewriter. No return address. Just a single sentence. She is safe but cannot come back. Fred brought it to the police. They examined it. No fingerprints, no DNA, no ink trace that could be followed. A prank, they said, or a cruel hoax. But Fred stared at that sentence for weeks, because the word safe offered something he hadn't felt in years, a sliver of warmth. And even if it was a lie, it was a different kind of lie than the ones he'd been told before, less cruel, more haunting. The internet community erupted with theories. If Maura had started a new life, where was she now? Had she crossed into Canada? Had she joined a commune, entered a shelter and changed her identity? Was she running from something deeper, a trauma, a fear, a secret so consuming that she had to cut every tie to survive? There were clues to support almost anything. A pattern of emotional distress in the weeks before her disappearance. The lies she told to professors, the small, deliberate choices that didn't quite add up. The clean dorm room, the unlabeled destination, the lack of communication, the lack of a trail. And yet, there was always the car. That black Saturn, nose first in a snowbank, pointed the wrong direction, keys gone, doors locked. A wine box spilled, a book in the passenger seat. No signs of a hasty exit, no sign of a plan gone wrong, just the car waiting, as if the road itself had swallowed her. New documentaries started to approach the case again. One in particular aimed not to solve the mystery, but to tell it as a story of grief, of what it means to love someone who's missing. They filmed Fred, now older, thinner, sitting in his kitchen beneath a wall of timelines and photos. He didn't cry, he rarely did anymore. But when asked what he would say if he could see Maura again, he paused for a long time, then said, "I'd say, it's okay, just come home. Everything else can wait." There was a silence in the room when he said it. The kind of silence that holds more than absence. It holds time and pain and the impossible weight of not knowing. By then, the cold case unit had quietly reclassified Maura's disappearance. Not publicly, not officially, but internally some investigators no longer considered her a walkaway. They were looking at it differently now, not as a woman who vanished by choice, but as a woman who may have been taken, or may have trusted the wrong person. But no one said this publicly. There was no press release, no update, just silence. And the woods, and a father who still drove north every year, hoping the trees might change their mind. Because even now, so many years later, there remained that one terrible truth, the one no one could ever unsee. Maura Murray didn't vanish in the middle of a crowd, she vanished in the middle of nowhere. And somehow no one saw a thing. The wind along Route 112 had a different weight now, not just cold but memory. After more than 17 years, the trees didn't just line the road, they loomed like sentinels guarding whatever truth had been buried beneath bark and snow. In the stillness, you could almost believe the forest knew something, and if it did, it had never told. Fred Murray was still listening. Even now, even after all the false starts and empty promises, he returned to that place like clockwork. It had become his private pilgrimage, not just to mourn, but to remind the world, and himself, that Maura mattered, that she was not forgotten, that a missing woman is not just a mystery to solve or a headline to share, but a human being with breath, memory, love. He didn't bring flowers anymore. That felt too final. Instead, he brought maps, files, ideas. He brought the stubbornness of a man who refused to let time win. One October morning, a new tip surfaced. A man from Vermont contacted a local reporter with a strange story. Years ago, while staying at a rental cabin near the White Mountains, he and a friend had encountered a young woman late at night, walking along a rural road, seemingly confused. She didn't say much, and when they offered her a ride, she refused. She looked scared. They watched her walk into the darkness. It had haunted him for years. He was only now connecting the timeline and geography to Maura's case. The details were vague, too vague to act on, but the emotion in his voice, the way he hesitated when recounting her face, it felt real. Julie Murray followed up. So did Fred. But by then the area had changed. The cabin was long gone, the road repaved, another maybe, another shadow. Meanwhile, the online community around Maura's case had grown both larger and more unstable. Podcasts came and went, each one digging into her story with new tones, some reverent, others exploitative. A few brought on guests close to the case. Others veered into outright speculation, creating episodes based on nothing but conjecture. Julie, ever measured and empathetic, began to publicly push back. She reminded listeners this wasn't a game. This was a family's real, ongoing pain. A wound kept open by the constant poking of curiosity disguised as concern. But the world kept clicking, and with each new update, Maura's image was reintroduced to another generation of readers, sleuths and true crime obsessives, and still no answers. In 2022, the FBI quietly updated their missing persons database with additional metadata for Maura's case. It wasn't a reclassification, it wasn't even new information, but it was a sign, however small, that someone was still working, still inputting, still cataloguing. A detective working behind the scenes, invisible to the public eye, but not idle. Around that time, a journalist began working on a book, one not about the case exactly, but about the culture that had formed around it. He interviewed forum moderators, researchers, even people who had once lived in Haverhill. What he uncovered wasn't a revelation about Maura, but about how a person's disappearance can ripple across hundreds, even thousands of lives. How a single moment, a car in a ditch, a girl in the snow can fracture a town, inspire strangers, ruin friendships, create obsession. He spoke with a woman who had once lived near the crash site. She said she never saw Maura that night, but that for years she heard whispers in town. Not confessions, just rumours that sounded rehearsed. Stories that felt too clean. A detail about a truck that had never been in the reports. A man whose behaviour had changed suddenly after that winter. She never knew what to make of it. But when asked why she never spoke to police, she shrugged and said, "Would it have made a difference?" That shrug, that slow, aching surrender was everywhere now. In the officers who no longer returned calls, in the reporters who stopped writing, in the volunteers who had once canvassed those woods with bloodhounds and flashlights and now couldn't even recall the last time they thought about Maura's name. Only Fred never shrugged. Only he still carried her forward, inch by inch, year by year. A breakthrough almost came in 2003. A man confessed to a crime in another state involving a woman who had gone missing under similar circumstances. He had a long history of violence, was known to travel through New England in the early 2000s. For a moment, hope rose, maybe too quickly. Investigators compared notes, cross-checked vehicle registrations, travel logs, witness statements. There were overlaps, but no confirmations. In the end, he was ruled out. But not before Fred had allowed himself to believe, just for one night, that the weight might be lifted, that the story might finally find its last page. It didn't. There was one more sighting, of course. There always is. This one came from a retired nurse in Toronto. She said a young woman had come into her clinic sometime in 2006. No ID, just a cut above her eye, nervous energy hair, and a Boston accent. She had been jumpy, paranoid, paid in cash, never gave a name. The nurse only remembered her years later when she saw Maura's face online. She swore it was her, she was certain. But without records, surveillance, or names, the story evaporated like fog in morning sun. And so the case returned to its centre, a missing woman, a frozen road, and silence. Julie kept speaking at conferences. She now represented not just Maura's voice, but the thousands of others who had gone missing and stayed missing. She had become the expert no one wants to be, the family member left behind, walking that strange line between hope and resignation. And when she spoke, she always ended the same way. We are not looking for closure. We are looking for truth, and those are not the same thing. Fred, now in his 70s, still walked with purpose. His steps were slower, but his mind remained sharp. When asked what kept him going, he didn't mention justice or closure, or even peace, and he just said, "Because she would have done it for me." There's a kind of love that never fades, not with time, not with silence, not even with loss. It's the kind that keeps going even when everything around it says stop. That's what Fred carried now. Not anger, not obsession, but that fierce, aching kind of love. And as long as Maura's body wasn't found, as long as the earth refused to give up its secret, that love would not let her story end. Because someone knows. Someone has always known. And even now, even after all this time, the forest still holds its breath, as if waiting. 20 years is a long time to wait for a voice that never answers. Long enough for witnesses to forget, for memories to bend, for leads to grow mossy and cold. But not long enough to make Fred Murray stop asking. He had grown older, his body stiffened by time and grief, but his heart, the part of him still tethered to his missing daughter, beat with the same rhythm as it did in 2004. He no longer searched the woods himself. He couldn't, but he still showed up, still spoke her name aloud to strangers, still kept her photo in his coat pocket, worn soft at the edges, the face of a young woman caught forever in a moment just before everything changed. The 20th anniversary of Maura's disappearance brought a new wave of attention. News outlets revisited the case, framing it now not just as a mystery, but as a measure of institutional failure. Some articles were sharp, critical, pointing out the lack of coordination in those crucial first days, the missed windows for warrants, the refusal to release key case documents to the family. Others were more reflective, exploring what it meant to grieve a person who may still be alive and the agony of living in limbo. A vigil was held that February. Not the first and probably not the last, but this one carried more weight. It had been 2 full decades. 2 decades of no confirmed sightings, 2 decades of no remains, 2 decades of silence. Snow had fallen early that week, frosting the trees like it had the night she vanished. People came from all over, reporters, podcasters, family members of other missing persons, even those who had followed the case from afar, strangers who felt like they knew her. Candles were lit, photos were shared, and when Julie spoke, her voice cracked but didn't break. "She is not just a story," she said. "She is my sister. She is loved. She is missed, and she deserves better than this." Afterward, Fred stood alone at the curve in the road where Maura's Saturn had been found. He didn't speak to the press. He didn't make a speech. He just stood there, the wind pressing his coat tight against him, and stared into the woods as if waiting for her to come walking out of them. That same year, something unusual happened. A retired detective from a neighbouring state, one who had loosely followed Maura's case over the years, decided to conduct a private review. He wasn't looking to solve it. He didn't believe in some grand conspiracy. He just believed that cold cases often benefited from fresh eyes and clean notes. With the Murray family's blessing, he gathered every public detail he could find. Statements, timelines, photos, news reports. He created a comprehensive spreadsheet, cross-referencing every known movement, every call, every anomaly. And he noticed something. A utility repair log from a property less than a mile from the crash site had never been linked to the investigation. The report mentioned a service call scheduled for the morning of February 10th, 2004, less than 12 hours after Maura went missing. The repair crew had noted unusual access issues at the site, a snow-covered driveway, footprints they hadn't made, and a shed door found slightly open despite fresh snowfall overnight. No one had followed up. The detective visited the property. It had changed hands several times since 2004. The current owner had no knowledge of the history. The shed was still there, though slightly sunken now, the roof beginning to bow. With permission, he searched it. Found nothing, just dust and the faint smell of gasoline and cedar. But something about that gap, that oversight, lingered. He documented it, shared it with Julie, with Fred, with the cold case unit. No one claimed it was a breakthrough, but it was something new, and after 20 years, even the smallest fracture in the silence was enough to feel like hope. But there was a different kind of silence growing too, one not in the woods, but in the systems meant to solve cases like this. Across the country, cold case departments were underfunded, understaffed, and overwhelmed. New cases piled up, older ones slid further into darkness. Maura's file, like so many others, had passed through the hands of at least 8 different lead investigators since 2004. Each brought different theories, different priorities, each one left without answers. There had been moments of friction between the Murrays and law enforcement, especially in the early years, but by now that tension had hardened into something else, resignation. Not that they were giving up, but that they had learned to stop expecting movement. They would drive it themselves, if necessary. Julie began working with other families of the missing, started giving talks on what she called survivor limbo, the unique psychological space occupied by loved ones of the disappeared. She spoke of the guilt that came from birthdays and holidays, the way even joy felt like betrayal. The pressure to act as if a person was dead when your heart still whispered otherwise. She spoke calmly, clearly, but every sentence carried an undertow. Because how do you talk about a sister whose story doesn't end? And how do you mourn when mourning feels like giving up? The idea that Maura had walked away from her life, while once dismissed by the family, still crept into conversation from time to time. Not because they believed it, but because it hurt less than the alternatives. If she had chosen disappearance, then at least she wasn't lying in a shallow grave somewhere, or at the bottom of a ravine waiting to be found by accident. But that kind of thinking required turning away from who Maura was, careful, kind, and not the kind of person to leave without a word. Not forever. And yet there were no good theories, just less painful ones. Every now and then someone would come forward with a dream, a psychic vision, a map drawn from intuition. Fred still listened, out of politeness more than belief, because after a while the lines between reason and desperation blur. When the facts have failed you, sometimes fiction is all that's left. In late 2024, the New Hampshire State Police quietly added Maura's case to a list of cold cases under active re-evaluation. No announcement was made, no new details released. But it was a shift, a tremor in what had long felt like a frozen world. A signal, perhaps, that someone behind a desk was thinking of her again. Fred still drove north that winter. The road hadn't changed. The woods were still thick, still stubborn. The bend where her Saturn crashed was still there, still sharp, still cruel. He parked nearby and stepped out, walking to the spot where she'd last been seen. His breath curled into the air. He stared out across the trees. It had been 20 years, and still she had not come home. But he stood there anyway, because maybe, just maybe, the forest would remember what it had tried so hard to forget. And maybe, if he stood there long enough, it would speak, even if only in whispers. The forest was the only constant. It had watched the world change while it stayed the same, dense and quiet, a tapestry of bark and shadow, hiding its truths beneath thick layers of moss and time. 2 decades had passed since Maura Murray vanished along Route 112, but the trees still stood unmoved. To them, nothing was unsolved. Nothing was out of place. The human ache for answers meant nothing to the soil, but to Fred Murray, every branch still whispered her name. In the fall of 2025, a new wave of public interest surged, not because of a new clue or a groundbreaking lead, but because of a documentary that landed harder than most. Titled The Space Between, The Disappearance of Maura Murray, it approached her story from a different angle. Not investigative, not speculative, but deeply emotional. It told the story not just of Maura's vanishing, but of what had been left behind, the lives held in suspension, the grief that had learned to put on a polite face in the supermarket, the days punctuated by the strange emptiness of a ringtone that never played again. Julie was featured heavily. She had become the steward of her sister's memory, the voice of calm in a storm that had outlasted almost everyone else. In the film, she spoke not of suspects or maps, but of birthdays missed, of wondering what Maura would think of the world today, of asking herself whether she had been a good enough sister, if she should have called that day, if her silence had somehow mattered. And when the camera asked what she feared most, her answer came quickly. That Maura's story will be turned into just another puzzle, and that we'll stop remembering she was a person. That fear was not unfounded. Over the years, countless podcasts and YouTube channels had picked apart the case. They'd zoomed in on Maura's ATM video frame by frame, questioned her choice of alcohol, examined her email to professors as if it were a coded message. Some meant well, many didn't. The story had become a symbol, and then, inevitably, a commodity. But this documentary pulled it back, made it intimate again, and in doing so it touched people in a way that facts alone never could. It also reignited attention from the very people who had once closed their doors. The day after the documentary aired, a woman in her early 60s called a tip line. She didn't give her name, said she had lived near the crash site in 2004, that her husband, now deceased, had once come home that night behaving strangely. Silent, cold, covered in snow, he wouldn't speak to her until the next morning. And when he did, he only said, "Don't ask me about last night." She had never forgotten it, but she had never told anyone, not even her children. She wasn't accusing him of anything. She just couldn't hold it anymore. Investigators followed up. The home had since been sold, the man's truck long gone, but they pulled records anyway, found nothing concrete, just another hollow shape in the fog. Still, it was something new, a voice that had never spoken before, and maybe, just maybe, there were others still holding secrets they no longer wished to carry. Fred heard about the call from a reporter. He didn't get excited, he didn't speculate, he just nodded. "If that's true," he said, "then maybe this isn't over." But he'd said that before. He'd said it for 20 years. Still, there was something different now, a sense of fatigue in the silence, a heaviness in the way the story refused to resolve. It was no longer just an absence. It was a weight pressing down on the town itself. Haverhill had become a name whispered online more than it was spoken by its own residents. Outsiders passed through, taking photos of the curve in the road, of the trees where Maura was last seen. Some stopped to leave flowers, others stayed longer than they should. The town had learned to grow wary of outsiders, but it couldn't shake them, not until the story ended, and so far it hadn't. In the background, the Murray family's lawsuits to obtain access to sealed investigative files continued. Their legal team argued that after 2 decades, transparency was not just a right, it was a necessity. The cold case designation, while keeping the investigation nominally active, had become a barrier. Police refused to comment. A judge delayed the decision. Again. But public pressure was rising. People had grown tired of institutions hiding behind red tape. They weren't asking for suspects to be named, just for the truth to be shared, whatever it might be. Maura's name started trending again online, this time not because of a wild theory, but because of compassion. Thousands of people shared posts that simply read, "She still matters." The hashtag carried across timelines, platforms, even into physical spaces. Flyers reappeared in coffee shops and on lampposts in cities far from New Hampshire. Her face, 21 years old, smiling faintly, unaware of the storm that would follow, stared out at the world again, and people saw her. Because what had begun as a mystery was becoming something else, a reckoning with how we treat the missing, how we define justice, and how we measure the worth of someone who cannot speak for themselves. In Haverhill, the house, that house, was finally sold again. The new owners, aware of the history, reached out to the cold case unit voluntarily. They agreed to a fresh forensic sweep, cadaver dolls, ground-penetrating radar, full soil analysis. It was the most thorough search that property had ever undergone, and they found nothing. Again, no trace of Maura, no trace of anyone. The basement was cleared once and for all. Fred didn't say much when told, he only said what he always did. Then we look somewhere else. Because he couldn't stop, he never had. But the toll showed. He moved slower now, spoke softer. There was a gravity in his silences that hadn't been there before. Not despair, but something quieter, deeper. The kind of grief that doesn't cry anymore, that simply sits with you in the long hours of night and waits for the next morning. And yet, for all that had been lost, for all the time that had been devoured by uncertainty, there remained one truth that refused to disappear. Maura Murray existed. She loved. She laughed. She ran track. She read books. She worried about grades. She made mistakes. She cried on the phone with her sister. She hugged her father goodbye. She printed out directions. She drove into the mountains. She looked someone in the eye and said, "I've already called for help." And then she was gone. But what remained was not just mystery. It was love. It was the shape of her absence, etched into every life she touched. It was a road in New Hampshire that still feels haunted. And it was a question, simple, sharp, and still unanswered, that hangs in the air for anyone who's ever heard her name. Where did Maura Murray go? The road looked the same. It always did. The curve along Route 112 just past the weathered barn where the snowbank still piled high in winter and the forest pressed close enough to listen. After more than 2 decades, nothing had changed in the landscape except the way people looked at it, no longer just as trees and asphalt, but as the place where a life paused and never resumed. The place where Maura Murray stopped being someone's daughter, sister, classmate, and became a question. It had been 21 years. Fred Murray stood at that familiar spot again, hands buried deep in the pockets of his coat. The wind swept over the road in low whispers. It had snowed again the night before, enough to cover footprints, enough to muffle sound. The sky was heavy with more, a grey ceiling sagging low with silence. Fred didn't speak. He didn't need to. He had said everything already, to reporters, to police, to God. This wasn't about words anymore. This was about presence, about standing where she had stood, about defying the passage of time by refusing to forget. He took a slow breath and looked out at the tree line. For years, people had tried to find the story in the data. They'd built timelines, heat maps, phone trees. They'd examined Maura's class schedule, her emotional state, her academic performance, her text messages. They'd dissected her relationships, her past mistakes, the minutiae of her final week like scholars parsing ancient text. But the truth had never emerged. Because the truth didn't live in theories, it lived in the gaps. in the 6 minutes between the crash and the arrival of the first officer, in the silence on the Red Cross calling card voicemail, in the rag in the tailpipe, in the house with the locked basement, in the face that resembled hers at a Canadian truck stop, in the way her sister's voice broke when she said, "We just want to bring her home." In all the places we looked, and all the places we didn't. Fred turned back toward his car slowly, each step measured, deliberate. The snow crunched beneath his boots. In his coat pocket, he carried the same photo he always did. Maura at 21, laughing mid-sentence, hair falling across her cheek. She wasn't posing. She didn't know the photo was being taken. It had become his favourite for that very reason. It was unguarded. Alive. He still kept her room at home almost exactly the way it had been. The same bedspread, the same books on the shelf. He dusted it regularly. Not because he thought she would come back, but because he needed somewhere to speak her name aloud without the world interrupting. Julie had moved forward in her own way. She had a family now, a career, but the ache never dulled. When asked, she described it not as pain but as weight, something she carried quietly every day tucked beneath her ribcage. She had accepted that they might never find Maura, but she had not accepted that Maura didn't deserve to be found. The cold case unit still had the file open, but years had gone by without any real movement. Some officers who had once worked the case had retired. Some refused to speak publicly. Some still clung to the idea that Maura had chosen to vanish. Others weren't so sure. No official statement had been made in years. And maybe that was the hardest part. Not the silence, but the indifference. Because there is nothing more brutal to a grieving family than the sense that the world has moved on, that the face still haunting their dreams has faded from everyone else's memory. But Maura hadn't faded. Not entirely. Every year, people still gathered near the site. Strangers who had read about her story, listeners of podcasts, students who had once lived in the same dorm, runners, nurses, fathers or daughters the same age Maura was when she vanished. They came not because they expected to find something, but because they understood something that most people never would. That the missing don't vanish from the world, they vanish in it. One moment you are. The next, you're a shadow shaped like a person. Still loved, still longed for, but no longer touchable. In 2026, the New Hampshire Attorney General's office quietly reviewed a request to declassify portions of Maura's case file. It was denied again. Ongoing investigation, they said. Risk to potential prosecution, they said. But no one could say what was being investigated, or if anything truly was. Fred wrote one final letter that year. He sent it to the AG, to the governor, to anyone who might listen. It wasn't angry, it wasn't pleading, it was tired, measured, a father asking once again for a measure of grace. In it he wrote, "I am not looking for someone to blame, I am looking for my daughter. I am 75 years old. I would like to know where she is before I go. I would like to know if she was scared, if she suffered, if she's at peace. I think a father deserves to know that, and I think a daughter deserves to be found." The letter went unanswered, but others read it, shared it, spoke about it, and for a brief moment Maura's name rose again, above the noise, above the algorithms, above the years, not as a case, not as a theory, but as a person who laughed in the sun, who called her sister late at night, who studied nursing to help others, who drove into the mountains looking for something, peace, space, healing no one could say, and who never came back. There was no twist ending, no final clue unearthed in the woods, no confession, no body, but there was still a name, and a love that refused to dim, because even now, even with the passing of time and the wearing down of hope, Maura Murray remained more than missing. She remained present, in the ache of her family, in the voices of those who remembered, and in the quiet curve of a snowy road where the world once stopped without warning. And maybe, in the end, that's what stories like this are for. Not to be solved, but to be kept.